Speaking of interviews, I'm honored to be able to have him on the show again. He came on last time, and we were going to talk about his book the first time, but we ended up talking about the New York primary results. And so he's come back so that we can talk about his book, The Fight for Four Freedoms. Professor Harvey Kaye, how are you today?
I'm okay. In fact, I'm particularly okay because University of Wisconsin faculties around the state have been taking a stand against a board of regents and a president of the UW system in whom we've lost confidence. So we had a major vote today on the UW Green Bay campus, and we declared our lack of confidence in the leadership of the entire University of Wisconsin system. A president and a board of regents appointed by the famous, or if you prefer, and I do prefer, infamous Scott Walker.
Scott Walker, right? No, we all do prefer the infamous Scott Walker around here. So tell me more about what that means and the next steps in that process. Where do you go from here in that process?
Well, honestly, votes of no confidence are a register, but they're mostly symbolic. There's nothing that we can make happen. And as I said in my remarks to the faculty senate today, I didn't expect any radical change. But it's important that faculties around the state of Wisconsin show solidarity with each other, and it's important that we make it clear to the citizens of the state and to the students who we teach that the way in which the university is being managed from high on top down in Madison is essentially unacceptable, and we expect smarter, more critical, more progressive, if you like, behavior out of those folks who are in charge of what I think has been, maybe no longer, but has been the greatest university system in the United States.
Awesome. So before I ask more questions about that, because that's how we got into it last week, and we never got around to your book last time.
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking that. Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same thing.
Because what you brought up is interesting, and listen, let me tell you, the last time you were here, my audience really appreciated everything that you had to say, and they appreciated your look towards progressivism, even beyond this election. So I want to say thank you on behalf of my audience, because New York was a tough night for a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who probably make up 90%, if not 99% of my audience. So they sent a lot of messages to me, and I don't know if they got to you, but I want to relay them to you. So let's go right into The Fight for Four Freedoms. First of all, I enjoyed the book. I had a chance to read it as I went into the city day by day, little by little. I want you to tell my audience, for those who haven't read it, could you give them the elevator pitch about it, and then we'll unpack it from there.
Okay, well, let's start with the kinds of things that actually pissed me off. That whenever I get pissed off is when I generally start writing. Although I do it with a smile on my face. I don't get pessimistic. Well, what it was is that first I'll mention that my father was a World War II veteran, and my family was solidly pro-Roosevelt. And so when I grew up, even as I moved further and further left and became rather critical of liberalism in favor of social democracy and progressivism, it was the case that I found the growing, the increasing number of attacks by the right on Franklin Roosevelt at the same time that the right was trying to lay claim to the whole greatest generation phenomenon. I found it very disturbing.
Yeah.
And then I also found disturbing the fact that folks on the left, in a knee-jerk like way, were also abandoning, in some ways, the Roosevelt tradition, but even more significantly, that they tended to be critical of the greatest generation phenomena. That is, the celebration of this generation of the 1930s and 40s. They thought it was all just in fact, there were those who actually thought it was a plot to make us all more eager to go to war again, or a plot basically to dampen our radical spirits, or a plot to overlook the prevalent racism of the day, or the anti-Semitism. I really was disturbed by the complete lack of critical thinking about all of those things that were accomplished in the 1930s and during World War II of a truly progressive nature. And I came to see the entire experience of the New Deal and then the fight against fascism in World War II as, in many ways, sort of embodied in Roosevelt's 1941 speech to the State of the Union speech, essentially, in which he was calling on Americans, in essence, to prepare for war. He was calling on Americans to become the arsenal of democracy. I mean, this was in January 41. We would not enter the war in a grand, in an official military capacity until December, when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. But if you think about what the Four Freedoms speech was, where he lays out this argument that Americans needed to envision a world marked by freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want. I mean, freedom from want, think about that, and freedom from fear. This was the vision he was offering. And what really impressed me about it is it was a vision that in many ways was driven by the accomplishments of the 1930s struggles, both the official New Deal and the labor and civil rights and women's struggles of the 30s to transform America in a more democratic fashion. And also, I came to see this speech, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, as one more expression of Americans' ideals, as opposed to simply something that we might be cynical about. Well, they didn't live up to it, or think about the tragedies and the evils that still occurred. And I don't deny those. I mean, I think it's the case that the Roosevelt administration did not, to my mind, adequately fight racism, did not, to my mind, adequately demand an open door for Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, and also segregated the American military during World War II, and also interned Japanese Americans. Those are sins and those are tragedies, and those should never be forgotten. But on the other hand, let's not forget that those who suffered the most from American racism and anti-Semitism and so on were also the ones who came out the strongest in the war effort. Most people were forgetting this. I mean, American Jews served out of proportion to their numbers in the U.S. population. Mexican Americans served well out of proportion to their numbers in the U.S. population. 1 million African Americans served, and even more might well have served, but there was a quota on the numbers allowed into the military. And in Japanese Americans' cases, 22,500 young men actually served in the most decorated military unit of World War II, the 442nd, in the European theater, and others served in military intelligence. Anyhow, to come back to my point about the Four Freedoms, is I thought we were completely missing the boat on FDR and the Greatest Generation. And as I say, and I say in my talks usually, is that, we often say, well, haven't we made enough of the Greatest Generation? No, I actually think we never made enough of the Greatest Generation, because what we failed to appreciate is that they were the most progressive generation in American history, in all their diversity, decidedly the most progressive. If you consider what they enabled and pushed Roosevelt to pursue, not only the regulation of big business by way of the Securities and Exchange Commission and a whole host of other agencies, they helped us recover from the Great Depression by way of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration. They threw their labors into these endeavors. I'm going on and on, aren't I? But if you want me to stop,
but that's what professors do. That's what professors do. I have no problem with you going on. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think that, and I will indeed go on. But even as they were doing all of that, it's the case that millions of Americans, men and women, white and black and brown, we could say, they organized labor unions all across the country, and the Roosevelt administration, along with Senator Wagner of New York and other Democratic senators, enacted the National Labor Relations Act in order to bolster labor union organizing. I mean, this was not only this, simply the AFL, which was the more conservative federation, but the new Congress of Industrial Organizations, which, by the way, insisted on desegregating industry and insisted on opening its ranks to women and to ethnic and racial minorities. I mean, this was an extraordinary generation.
So let me jump in there. Let me jump in there and ask some questions that I had after reading the book. And as you unpack the deep, rich historical perspective, some of the questions that come up to my mind are really with the Four Freedoms themselves. And both Roosevelt's usage of that alliteration almost during his speech, and the idea that some historians say that it was really just a rhetorical device to prepare America for war, but not necessarily something that he wanted to make actionable. So I want you to address that individual critique, but then also where those four freedoms are today in terms of the fight that you feel like we need to reignite for those four freedoms. Take those 2 points and elaborate a little bit for me.
Yeah, well, I'll start at the grand level and tell you that in the course of World War, for all of the foundations that were laid in the New Deal of the 30s in terms of combating poverty, combating inequality, enabling workers to organize. Oh, by the way, New Deal agencies in the 1930s, although Southern Democrats, who often controlled many of the committees in Congress, although the Southern Democrats wanted to pursue a decidedly segregated New Deal, the Roosevelt administration did not itself, though they often had to defer to that. But if we come forward, I mean, there were all of these accomplishments, both in terms of public efforts and struggles from below to make America freer, more equal, and more democratic in the 30s. And then the four freedoms are an articulation of that. The most interesting thing is that actually inequality, in part because of the war effort, but also because of specific and deliberate decisions by the Roosevelt administration, actually reduced inequality. So, for example, they actually set wages at a certain level, what we would think of as minimum wages, which enabled working poor, and that was in great numbers, African Americans and Mexican Americans, to actually rise in the standard of income. People ate better, started to live longer. I mean, it was a decidedly progressive moment. The other thing is that Philip Randolph, the great labor leader, pursued the desegregation of the war industries, demanded that Roosevelt actually issue an executive order declaring any federal contracted industries that did not desegregate, at least open the door to African American employment, should not be allowed to have those contracts. And when Roosevelt hedged, he hesitated when Randolph said he was going to bring 10,000 African Americans to march on Washington, and Randolph demanded an audience. Roosevelt gave him the audience. Randolph, when asked how many he was going to bring to D.C. as sort of the formality of the occasion, said, "I'm going to bring 100,000." And Roosevelt soon after signed the executive order. Now, what's interesting is we all know that Randolph really brought this pressure to bear, and it was a great moment. I think A. Philip Randolph was one of the greatest labor leaders and civil rights leaders of the 20th century. But the interesting thing is Randolph told people later that he knew Roosevelt was going to do it. He said, "Roosevelt wouldn't have let me in his office if he wasn't prepared to act." And that's critical. There was this sense on the part of this great African-American labor and civil rights leader that he had pressured Roosevelt to bring him in, and he knew that Roosevelt, as his office said, was going to say, "You've made me do it, we'll go ahead and do it." Then, moreover, in 1944, if I can go further, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, but if we go forward in 1944, in spite of the fact that conservative Republicans and Southern white supremacist Democrats did everything they could to block the foremost progressive initiatives, even of the war effort, the fact is that Roosevelt, in his 1944 State of the Union message, went before Congress and the American people and said that it was time, now that we've learned our lessons, it's time for Americans to enact a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights. In other words, freedom from want should become a part of our, if you like, Constitution. And he laid out such things as national health care. He also called for, food, clothing, and shelter as a guarantee, recreation as a guarantee. Now, you could say, well, this is fantasy talk. He's just trying to inspire the war effort. But listen to this. He requested from the White House that the National Opinion Research Commission run polls in 1943 and 1944, asking Americans what they want after the war. What kind of country do they want after the war? And what they discovered in the polling was that 85% of Americans essentially wanted a social democratic United States, including national health care, including the true right to work. That is a guaranteed job, not the right to work of the Southern white supremacists of the day and others, but a real right to work. That is, you were guaranteed a job. Also, that young people were guaranteed an education, which implied also, by the way, a college education. I mean, there's a grand vision that he was looking towards, found out that's what American wanted. And by the way, that included Republicans. It wasn't just the Democrats they
Right.
asked. They asked all
Well,
Americans.
with
So he
85%.
proposed this second Bill of Rights, 85%. I'm using that as the round number because that's actually the number that wanted a national
Yeah.
guaranteed health care program.
That's astonishing, astonishing, and as always, you've given me so much more that I can't even really lay an anchor. But I do want to circle back to A. Philip Randolph,
Right.
from Jacksonville, Florida, and there's actually a monument here in Boston at Back Bay Station where all this information is public, for public consumption. But I'm a huge
There's
fan of.
sorry, I didn't know that. There's a monument to Randolph?
Yeah, in Back Bay
There's a
Station, in Back Bay
No kidding.
Station
I didn't know that.
right here in downtown Boston. But yeah, so and it's a part of the Amtrak and his work, and for the union for the railroads. So that's a part of
the Pullman car work.
exactly. So it's a part of Jacksonville. I mean, of course, it's American history, but I mentioned that because I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. I spent some years there, and now I'm in Boston. And so when I left, when I jumped on the train and rode the train one time from Boston, from Back Bay Station to Jacksonville, I got off the train seeing A. Philip Randolph, and got on the train seeing A. Philip Randolph. And but it really speaks to his contribution during his time, not just for that union, but specifically with what you said, the demands that he placed on FDR, and how you're tying all this back into now the actual moves, those physical, tangible steps that FDR took towards the four freedoms. I want you to now, because you said something at the introduction of this that I kind of clung to, the rewrite of history almost, from conservatism towards this period of our greatest generation. It's almost like the co-opting of the greatest generation and trying to rewrite or erase that portion of the greatest generation, which was a fundamental fight for these four freedoms, which was they actually took moves toward this social democracy. And now they want to interpret America today and say the greatest generation was something other than this burgeoning social democracy. Talk more about that, that whitewashing, this my favorite word that I always use. Go ahead.
Well, almost immediately after Roosevelt's death, in spite of Harry Truman's efforts to make the four freedoms and the Second Bill of Rights very much a part of American public life and American government agencies' efforts, almost immediately Republicans set out to quash any kind of memory and action on the four freedoms and those economic Bill of Rights. For example, in 1946, when the Republicans took control of the House and the Senate, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which essentially allowed states, which meant especially in the South, to ban the closed shop. In essence, it set up terrible, almost impossible barriers for labor union organizing. Now, why were they so keen to block labor union organizing? Not only did they hate labor unions, these Southern white supremacists, they knew that labor unions were probably going to be the greatest vehicle alongside of the civil rights movement for the desegregation of the South. So, in essence, that's the first thing. Moreover, in order to quash that 85% of Americans' desires to secure national health care, Southern white supremacists did everything in their power to basically block Harry Truman's efforts to secure national health care. And why were the Southern white supremacists so concerned? Because if national health care passed, they were going to have to desegregate Southern hospitals. I mean, even though 85% of Americans, and believe me, more than others, I imagine people in the South wanted national health care because they were the poorest section of the country. It was truly a backward area of the country. So, in essence, right from the beginning, they were doing everything they could to quash the possibility of the four freedoms and economic Bill of Rights becoming enacted. Now, the generation itself, I'll make...
Okay, yeah, go ahead with that point, and I want to ask a follow-up question. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say, well, I want to say that, and I do want to come back to these other things, and if we don't get through it all tonight, you and I will talk again, I hope.
Absolutely.
But if we think there's this arc from the 1930s right through to the 1960s. So when we talk about the greatest generation, and for all of the faults and failings of Tom Brokaw and his work, and he wrote the book, The Greatest Generation, one of the things at least he showed is that there was this arc. So if you figure 1935, these young men and women are 15. In 1945, they're 25, and veterans. In 1955, they're 35. In 1965, they're 45. They're in their maturity. They're the folks, by the way, who, for all of their faults and failings, for all of the, again, I mean, and they were serious, their faults and failings, these were the folks who actually did enact, when pressed by young people, did enact the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They reformed the immigration laws in this country in 1965. They passed the environmental protection laws, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They created the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I mean, I could go on and on. These were the folks who fulfill those ambitions of the 30s and the Four Freedoms, or not fulfill, but they go a good way towards fulfilling those things in the 1960s when pushed by my generation, which probably had failed to appreciate what our parents were capable of.
So here's a question that no problem. Listen, I'm actually in a doctoral program now, so I'm used to professors going on and on. So I actually enjoy it. But what I want to ask you now is that is the foundation of what the Four Freedoms are. That is the move away for some of the reasons. I know there's a lot more to it, but you've outlined how we moved away from the focus on it. Yeah, you've touched it.
I mean, I could go on and on about the suppression of memory. Can I give you one final example on the suppression of memory? I know we don't have a great deal of time, but let me give, Ronald Reagan, who served in the American military during World War II, was himself in the 30s and 40s an avid Roosevelt supporter. His service in the military involved basically sleeping at home and making movies in Southern California in favor of the war effort. Nevertheless, he was in uniform. And he used to relish reciting lines of Roosevelt's speeches. That's the kind of fondness he had. Well, in the course of the 1950s, he moved further and further right and became absolutely viciously anti-New Deal. And yet he never gave up a kind of fondness for Roosevelt. Well, when he became president of the United States, of course, in 1980, he was elected. 81, he becomes president. Through his years in the White House, he did what he could to suppress the memory, in spite of all of his talk about the greatest generation, to suppress the memory of the Four Freedoms. And what he did in his farewell address is astonishing. He talked about the importance of American memory, and he said Americans should teach their children about American freedom. And then he said, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of enterprise, and completely expunged from any kind of public reference freedom from want and freedom from fear.
Wow, that is rather. That when you put it in context like that, the shift from being a supporter and a person who recited FDR to a person who completely rewrote FDR in his farewell speech, that's really disturbing. So there are many reasons we as a nation have moved from this progressive ideal, particularly the freedom from want. Right, freedom from want is probably the very bottom of the list right now in terms of what we are even willing to consider in the United States. So what are some tangible steps that you see that we can do to actually begin the fight for those freedoms, all four of them?
Well, I had great hopes. I had great hopes that we would begin to see the reversal of 40 years of class war from above when we elected Barack Obama. I mean, this was the man who told us, yes, we can, and young people got excited and enthused. We've seen, look, I mean, there's undeniable accomplishments in the Obama administration, including, Obamacare. But Obamacare is hardly the vision of Franklin Roosevelt and hardly the vision of the greatest generation. It's a massive corporate giveaway. I mean, giveaway to the pharmaceutical and health insurance industries. Admittedly, we're covering more people. But I think what we need to remember is this. There is no victory for the Four Freedoms if we don't get organized. And this is the kind of thing I was talking about last time when I was on. I mean, we have two candidates right now, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in the Democratic Party, both of whom in their way are trying to lay claim to the Roosevelt legacy. Hillary Clinton launched, you may recall, her campaign last spring, I think it's about a year ago now, at the Four Freedoms Park in New York City on Roosevelt Island.
Mm.
And I'll just say, and to be fair, what do they call this? Not a confession, but want to make clear I was one of the historical advisors to that park, so
Okay.
I have a particular commitment to that park.
Full
And
disclosure.
Hillary made it a point of launching there. That's the word. Thank you. Full disclosure, the term. And then Bernie Sanders, who it took him a while, but when he finally spoke publicly about where his ideas came from, back in November when he went to Georgetown University and talked about democratic socialism, he made it very clear he was drawing on Franklin Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights and Martin Luther King's democratic socialist ideals. And I will tell you that Martin Luther King, whatever criticism he clearly would have had about the New Deal years and the way in which the war effort was pursued, took a real note out of Franklin Roosevelt's playbook and also spoke in terms of minority and poor people's bills of rights, basically to try to remind people of Roosevelt's own economic bill of rights.
Right.
So look, I mean, we need to get organized. I mean, and by the way, I mean, I belong to two labor unions, and I've been very disappointed at the AFL-CIO's lack of commitment to the more progressive of our two Democratic candidates. But somehow or other, we really do need to empower labor. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to do it. We have to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That's the way you fight poverty. But we then need to empower workers, and that's the way you fight inequality. And I think that's fundamental. So, I mean, my hope is that Bernie Sanders, can pull this out and win the nomination. Beyond that, my hope is that we find a way to get ourselves better organized. Those of us in labor unions should make more of a demand on our labor leadership to start turning out and basically demanding instead. Look, when Barack Obama became president, the labor movement remained quiet. It did not become the loyal opposition, but rather stood by him and refused to offer criticisms. And that was a major mistake. Well, if labor is going to support Hillary Clinton, if it has to be, then damn it, my labor unions and other labor unions must be a more vocal, if necessary, loyal opposition and make demands on these Democrats. They've gotten away too long with a retreat from the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a dear friend of mine who in an interview today said that it's at the point where she's demanding that the Democratic Party reintroduce themselves to identify who they really are and what they really stand for, because they no longer stand for what she firmly believed all her life, voting for years upon years, all Democrats. But now it's a time to really reevaluate that. And I love the way that you put it, that they've just gotten so far away from that FDR tradition that they're not recognizable right there. And I think that's where we are. Professor Kaye, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't mean to keep you if we're running out of time. But the thing is, I'll name names in all of this.
Go ahead.
I mean, think about the retreat from the Roosevelt tradition. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is the man who introduced, and no one seems to remember this, but go look at his speeches, the idea of austerity. He was the one who called for austerity in government. He's the one who began the deregulation of finance, the deregulation of transportation. He paved the way. I think it was Truman or someone said, if you're given a choice between a phony Republican and a real Republican, you might as well choose the real thing. And basically, Jimmy Carter became the phony Republican, and Ronald Reagan was the real one. And people stayed home basically, or they voted for Reagan. So you got Jimmy Carter. Then you have Mondale. Everyone remembers it. By the way, how old are you, Ben?
I'm old enough. I missed Mondale by a little bit. I'm 36.
Okay, well, you're a boy. Yeah. Sorry, I meant that in the nicest way, okay?
Wait a minute.
Sorry. Bad. No, you know what I mean.
I know what you meant, but that's a good one. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, what I'm getting at in that is that Mondale said, Reagan isn't going to tell you, but we're going to tell you, we're going to raise your taxes. If that's the best the Democrats could do, we knew we were in trouble.
Yeah.
Then Dukakis, who was a policy wonk and offered very little, he lost. He was 17 points ahead of Bush, and then he still lost the presidential campaign.
Yep, I remember that one.
Then let's come to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, look, let's count the ways. NAFTA, okay, the Communications Act.
Yep.
The deregulation of the banks, the end of Glass-Steagall. The bill enacting, basically mass incarceration. I mean, over and over again, which, by the way, garnered the lobbying support of Hillary Clinton repeatedly. We could also talk, we don't have time to talk about how he almost gave away Social Security to Newt Gingrich, but we'll take that up another time. And then you think about how over and over again these Democrats are, they go, at best, they run like Eisenhower Republicans. The only thing that we can at least say now is Bernie Sanders
Yeah.
recognized what Americans,
We're
young
missing.
Americans especially,
Yeah.
were missing. And basically, he tapped into this incredible, if you like, Americanism, the best of Americanism. And, over and over again, wins young people's votes to the tune of 85% in some states.
Yep.
I mean, think about that. I mean, he puts social democracy back on the public agenda. This has been an extraordinary year. We may not win the way we want to, but it's been an extraordinary year, and we
Absolutely.
should build on our accomplishments.
Absolutely. Professor Kaye, I am out of time, but I would like for you to tell everyone how they can not only get up with you, but how they can get a copy of your book.
Okay, please, if you get a chance, if you're on Twitter, it's at Harvey J. Kaye. That's Kaye. Ben, remember, Kaye.
I got you right
okay?
this time.
Right. Okay, Harvey J. Kaye. Also, if you can, please do pick up my book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. If you want to look, I think it'll give you energy. I think it can inspire. I mean, it's not over yet. Basically, it's up to us to make America great again, our way, great and good again, not the Trump way.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And I look forward to hearing from any of you. Please don't hesitate to write me if you're on Twitter.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Professor Kaye. It's always a pleasure. We'll get to some more deep dives. Actually, a couple of people who sit in on the show with me, they want to connect with you and for us to do a panel where we can actually talk about this at great length and not try to squeeze all of this
That would be
substance
great.
into 30 minutes. We probably need a panel that lasts at least 2 hours to really unpack this in a meaningful way. So thanks so much for joining
I
us.
would love to come on for longer. Love it. Love it. Thank you, Ben.
My pleasure.